Welcome to our second keynote speaker of the day, Morten Nissen. Morten is a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. Morten's work discusses theoretical problems of collectivity, practice, standards, and subjectivity. Anchored in the tradition of critical psychology and subject science, he often transgresses disciplinary boundaries. Morten frequently draws from French and German philosophy in his works, one among them his book, The Subjectivity of Participation, published with Palgraph. Today, Morten will talk to us about crisis and meta motives. Morten?
I'm Morten Nissen from University of Aarhus. Let me apologize for the sound quality. I have to stand in this empty room for various practical reasons. But I hope you can hear me anyway. I'm going to talk about crisis and meta motives. So first, some general framing considerations around what this is. Is this a crisis or is it just an exception? And that then onto the considerations about psychology and motivation psychology. For which I claim critical psychology has some problems that maybe can be solved or moved on by looking at a theory developed in the 70s by someone called Ute Osterkamp. And then I'll try to relate to practical issues concerning aesthetics and give a practical example of how that sort of realizes the notions of meta motivation. And then finally return to the question of how we can contribute to this crisis exception issue as social scientists. So I think in general there is a debate or a dilemma, a problem, whether this corona situation is just a passing time of exception, or does it sort of relate to something deeper? Should it relate to something deeper? Is it a state of exception, as theorized by Carl Schmitt, who says that the sovereignty of the state shows itself in states of exception? And so a deeper issue of power and sovereignty is revealed in such states of exception, which is what we see now. The state suddenly appears, whereas it has been sort of in the background for a long time. Another theoretical inspiration could be the issue of liminality in anthropology from Van Gennep, where the liminal phase in transition rituals was a phase in which a lot of things were sort of turned upside down. And as exception to the usual rules in the culture, and from what was before the transition ritual and what was after. And then Victor Turner and later Paul Stemmer also theorized that, well, maybe liminality is a more general thing that has to do with the development of modernity, for better and for worse. So the exception in situations of liminality might be something that reveals an underlying greater development. And I think this is where we connect both hopes and fears. So here is the French philosopher Bruno Latour saying, to the common sense demand, let's relaunch production as soon as possible, we must respond with the cry, above all, no. The last thing we should do is to redo all the same things we did before. So he is appealing to the reason of decision makers. And why is that? Well, that's of course because what we are now learning is to take care of ourselves or our world, and we must use that in order to intervene in the climate crisis, which we haven't, not far as much as we ought to do. So he hopes that this is a dress rehearsal for the more fundamental and more important crisis of the planet, which this corona crisis can be seen to be part of. And he says he has this hopeful hypothesis that the health crisis prepares, induces, incites us to prepare for climate change. This is a hypothesis that still needs to be tested, he says. So this is the hopes, the utopia, connected to the notion of crisis in this time. But of course, here is Trump and Modi to remind us that there is a dystopian version of the same thing. When the state shows its powers, that might be not such a nice thing, not such a reasonable, not such a rational thing. It might be the shock doctrine, in the words of Naomi Klein, where sort of the exception is used by powerful corporate interests to reduce democracy and reduce our ability to deal with the deeper crisis. But then Naomi Klein recently posted this in The Guardian, a new version of the shock doctrine, a pandemic shock doctrine beginning to emerge. He says, call it the Green New Deal, more high-tech than anything we've seen, and so on. So it's about the big tech companies utilizing this to push forward their control of teaching and regulation being done in terms of how we do it right now. So this is more of a disaster doctrine that says, it's not a deterioration of the state; it's a continuation. It's actually a continuation of neoliberal governance, which is not about dismantling of the state. On the contrary, it's the state as a strong state, but only strong when it supports business, when it supports business as usual, when it makes sure that this is just a passing time of exception rather than confronting a deeper crisis, for instance, a crisis of democracy or climate and so on. But exactly this this way of thinking, the fusion of the state with civil society, with business, it's a kind of strength that, on the other hand, makes the state vulnerable to the deeper crisis. As the French philosopher Barbara Stiegler says about the healthcare system, that it's being governed in ways where we must perform, we must adapt. This is the injunction on the basis of which the hospital has been managed. And this constant flux, it is impossible to face the unknown. This neoliberal vision is totally contrary to the conditions of life and the basic needs of the living. And it's not only valid for the hospital, it's also the case in the world of research and education, which has been destroyed by this culture of optimization and innovation amidst scarcity. So actually, what sort of emerges, and we have experienced in the past decades, is a very thin concept of subjectivity. It's a very exceptional thing. It's a predetermined world. Nothing can be done to change it. But once in a while, there is a choice. Ian Parker, in a review of Zizek's impressive book already on the corona crisis, expresses it in the Lacanian language like this: what is COVID-19 but the name through which we try to tame and make sense of what is emerging, take it into reality, something senseless that is hitting us and killing us, something of the real. And this kind of matches a big trend, I think, in popular culture as well. A popular series on HBO and is it Netflix? No, I think it's HBO. Deaths in Westworld. Both are sort of about this issue that the free will is no longer free, and it's partly because of the development of high tech and big tech. So only in a very specific situation, a very particular hero or heroine in both these cases will emerge to make the decision that might provide a hope for a change of something. So this is a situation in which appeals seem completely futile. Here's one of them. French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, whom I have collaborated a bit with recently because I've been in Paris before I was sent home in this corona situation. Addressed the United Nations with this appeal called the Inter-Nation, and to sort of argue for we have to address the problem with the climate crisis, but also the problem with how we cannot control it because of the development of technologies of information that sort of form the ways we approach ourselves in ways we don't know. But it seems sort of futile. Back in the 20th century, there were theories that sort of connected to forces in politics. Important thing, mostly through the 20th century, at least in Europe, was to say, well, the labor movements were real political movements with forces that would push. Change didn't happen because of appeals from clever scientists. It happened because of the popular forces, the movements, the labor movements, the feminist movement, and so on and so forth. But where are they now? And also, to take up the term that Stiegler has used, science, reason itself is a pharmacon, which means it's both poison and a remedy. So this Enlightenment idea that we should sort of, on advice from philosophers and scientists, rebuild the world from scratch is not necessarily a very positive idea. This is actually what ended up producing this climate crisis. Ernst Bloch wrote already around the time I was born, our technology so far stands in nature like an occupying army in enemy territory. So maybe we shouldn't trust science. This is Daenerys Targaryen in the Game of Thrones. And this is to illustrate the idea that we can sort of catch the winds of change. There's this Chinese proverb saying, when the winds of change blow, some build walls, but others build windmills. So this notion of a jiu-jitsu trick that we can take the forces of the winds of change and use them is like sort of riding the dragon, illustrated in this series. And here's how it ends up burning down everything. So we are learning, I think, slowly that we should be wary, we should be cautious about this notion of the rational building of the world. Now, what's the alternative? Well, you could say the alternative is a more modest notion of a slow science that sort of contributes to a cultivation that might make us more resistant and wise in the face of crisis. There's a version of this, the Belgian philosopher Ute Osterkamp says we have to reclaim the way we can affect other struggles aimed at the creation of a future worth living. This demands what I would call an ecology of partial connections, which requires learning from others, being transformed by what is learned, acknowledging our debt to this transformative experience as we explore its problematizing impacts in our own terms. Making partial connections means, first of all, accepting being situated. So we don't sort of design the better world, giving advice to politicians and so on. We more modestly sort of engage in situated debates and dialogues and build up knowledge in relation to that. So that's the sort of general hope. But let's look at psychology. How does psychology fit into this question of exception or crisis, or how to deal with it? Well, the overall answer I would give to this is that psychology is mostly very pragmatic. So psychology mostly fits better with the notion of crisis as an exception that will return to business as usual. If you go back a century, a lot of psychologists would, like William James, Vygotsky, and others would claim that psychology was in a crisis. So that's why it was necessary to build theories that addressed the crisis of psychology. But then in what we might call mainstream psychology, this crisis was overcome pragmatically by using positivism, a sort of fragmented science of causes and effects within a framework of a normal understanding of the world, in the framework of business as usual. This was how psychology actually grew in power, actually became more and more important in forming the ways we understand ourselves and who we are. And this implies pushing aside subjectivity, ignoring crisis, and mostly actually ignoring the burning issues that arose in the middle 20th century when psychology really became popular and so on. And I think there is a problem at the core of this, which is that psychology is supposed to address subjectivity, to address who we are and how we live our lives. But it's actually by pushing aside the core of what it's there for that it's growing and becoming popular. In the field of motivation, this is maybe especially the case. Motivation was, in a way, born as the notion of how can we find out whether and why and how much people are willing to do what they have to do. So we have these standardized tasks, standardized activities within the fields of industry and education first, and then later other fields. And the question is, do they want to do what we know that they want? So this is the notion of energy that arises, a very reduced version of subjectivity. Can we find out about the machinery of this energy and how it's directed in relation to standardized activities? The functions, between the functions of the organism and the functions of the machinery of industry and education and its tasks. In order to conceptualize that, the notion of needs was in the first half of the 20th century used, and there's a history of a sort of a growing acknowledgement of needs, which at the beginning were needs that had to be addressed in order to motivate people. To begin with, they were quite primitive and simple, but then gradually social needs were recognized, needs for self-realization, needs to be treated humanly, and so on. And finally, actually needs for autonomy, needs to control, needs for self-determination were put forward in the 70s. And of course, this leads to an issue or a problem, because now we want to find out whether and why people want to do what we already know that they should do. We have defined the tasks already, but now we have to address their needs to be those who define the tasks. In the self-determination theory of Bryan and Dege and others, this is in the form of a liberal notion of autonomy, a choice of predefined activities, and the competence in delivering them, and then those aspects of activity are separated from the notion of relatedness, which is the third sort of basic quality that satisfies the needs for self-determination in that kind of theory. So in a way, you might say, in terms of self-determination, it's a quite reduced notion, and that's how sort of the problem of how to address needs for autonomy was solved in that theory. But what became much more important was a much more pragmatic approach, where you sort of forget about needs, the metaphysics of needs, and just address the pragmatics of cognitive self-regulation. So this is what you see. You just make machineries with or without technologies in which you get people to reflect how they set goals and how they are what's it called the self-efficacy. And so these sort of banal ideas, the more you think you can actually do something, the more you might be motivated to do it, which of course is obvious. But one of the most famous findings in the later half of the 20th century in psychology. So this leads to a problem of meta-motivation. Now here's the original formulation of the concept of meta-motivation taken. It's in the 60s, but developed a bit earlier by Abraham Maslow, where he talks about meta-motivation as something that characterizes a specific kind of individuals, those who are more mature, more fully human, and thus are self-actualizing. Those are the ones who might sort of relate reflexively to their motives and to why they do what they do. So this is the notion of meta-motivation that is built in to this humanist psychology. But look what's happened to it. We can find it here in one of the modern theorists or scientists of motivation called Murayama, which is basically metacognition. Recently, he says, we propose to call metacognition about motivation meta-motivation. I actually asked him why is this meta-motivation? Because the normal use of the word meta is sort of a doubling of the same, so it would be motivation for motivation. And he replied, well, that's a good point. Maybe we should have done that. But sort of this reduction of the problem of meta-motivation to one of metacognition is quite characteristic of the pragmatics of today's cognitive psychology. And it shows actually in what is done in practice in fields like motivational interviewing, which is maybe the most famous counselling method in general, a version of the cognitive approach to counselling. What you do is you get you set up a conversation in which people voice their goals and their targets, and you sort of manipulate it in the direction of the good targets. So, for instance, reducing tobacco smoking, etc. And so it's again the banality of what any successful salesperson knows that is used to manipulate self-regulation. And if you run into the problem of meta-motivation, am I motivated for being motivated like that? Am I motivated for engaging in motivational interviewing? Well, the way to approach it is directly to engage in motivational interviewing. So this is the state of the art, I think, in broad terms in mainstream psychology. And it's sort of it's easy to see the connections in terms of more wider ethical and political issues to neoliberal governance. We sort of leave behind the big meta questions, the ethical, political, metaphysical questions, and just engage in the machinery of self-regulation. Now, in critical psychology, the story is different because critical psychology from the beginning sort of holds on to crisis, reconnects the crisis in psychology to social issues and addresses subjectivity. And if you look at how critical psychology is sort of more or less off mainstream, have addressed the notion of motives and motivation, it's characteristic that it's been formed and has not yet been able to sort of move beyond the divide between the public and the private, between production and care, between the public sphere and the family. So on the one hand, you have the theories about motives based on the active participant subjective production, and you have that in the social cultural activity theory, the Vygotskian tradition, and in pragmatism. Whereas the passive subject in inner conflict is theorized in psychoanalysis, which has increasingly become an off-mainstream kind of psychology. So of course, what we should do is to try to find ways to overcome this division. Anyway, critical psychology generally theorizes in both these approaches how motives are formed in culture, including the culture developed by psychology itself. The question then becomes, of course, does that mean, after all, we're left with determinism? Does that mean that we can understand the motives of the individual subject completely if we understand the cultural environment? And that question sort of leads to two kinds of answers. One is kind of a humanism that sort of is dualist because it sort of divides the desire, the urges of the human in two forms. In the psychoanalytic tradition, we have the distinction of drive from desire, and in cultural historical activity theory, in Rancière and so on, we have the distinction between primary and higher cultural needs, and those are sort of divided from each other. And the problem is that either nature or more often culture is actually idealized. So the good thing is to the sublimation of drive into desire. The good thing is to the appropriation of the higher cultural needs in the Rancière and so on and so forth. And the other solution to that is a kind of, I think, widespread today, is a kind of, we might call it post-humanism with Haraway and others, where you sort of leave behind the whole problem of motives and motivation in favor of what you might call emergent process and things like that. So here's an example of it, a recent example, which is a very interesting and nice book by Dimitris Papadopoulos, where it says, performing ontological politics means to open up matter as a field of exploration, experimentation, and ultimately appropriation. Ontological politics conceives matter as a frontier. In every frontier, expansion takes place as inclusion of new territories and entities in the process of continuous creation of new worlds. So this notion of matter as a frontier, I think is really interesting. But there is this idea of a continuous creation of new worlds, which is so abstract and so general that it sort of leaves behind the whole question of motives and needs and how they're based. And in that sense, it comes to, I think, involuntarily, of course, confirm the anti-metaphysics, the emptiness of neoliberal pragmatics. And so we need sort of a different approach that sort of takes out the ideas about how motives are formed in culture, overcomes the dualism in humanism, and then sort of can suggest a more substantial approach to motives. And here's my suggestion. It's the only image I can find on the internet of Ute Osterkamp, who wrote this book called Motivation Research, Motivationsforschung, back in 76, 75 and 76. And I think there's an answer to these problems if we read this research in the right way. What was the question posed? It was the question of the problem of ideology. Can the subject, the individual subject, resist social forces, ideological forces, without being antisocial? Can we overcome the dualism there? And the answer is, well, we have this notion of agency. In German, it's called Handlungsfähigkeit. So it's translated agency. And the notion of agency here is a broader notion of self-determination which is through participation. And actually, it has a long philosophical background coming from Spinoza, through Hegel and Marx. This was the 70s, and this was an attempt to develop the Marxist psychology. So the idea was that there's this process which we could call praxis, which is the general process of a communal, proactive care for life. And this is a process that goes on through ever-developing culture. So it's doing work, creation, struggle, and care in the interest of developing culture and culture as a proactive care for life. So this is a kind of very general, you might call it ethical ideal, but the idea is that there are good reasons to suppose that humans evolved as insofar as they were able to not only have the ability to take part in it, but also have the desire to take part in this process. So this is the true motivation. There are other needs and motivations as well, but importantly, human motivation is the need for expanding agency. Now, how does that come about? Well, there's the aspect of I want to develop my participation in this process, but there's also the aspect I want to develop this process itself, developing practice. So this is human nature, and it includes wanting to co-create cultures. It includes the joy of recreating ourselves and our motives. This is the hypothesis here. And it has some useful complexities, actually, with which we can approach what we have called meta-motives, a way which is, I think, more useful than the original Maslowian conception and the modern metacognitive notion. First of all, subjectivity is basically dilemmatic or contradictory. This comes from the Spinoza background because it's about remaining oneself and it's about overcoming oneself. So it has this sort of conflict built into it as the driving force of subjectivity. And also, if we think of it through participation, it's obvious that participation implies both moments of submission and moments of revolt. So we have to sort of engage in participating in something, but we also want to be able to participate in recreating it and expanding it. And this is not so clear in Ute Osterkamp's original formulation, but since then, quite a few of us have worked to think about situated activity in different ways. And so what is at stake here is the co-emergence of the collective and the person, we and the I. So with Vygotsky, we could call it the zone of proximal development of the self. I learn to take care of myself through participating in the common practice where we take care of me. So we can think here of the co-individuation, as Gilbert Simondon calls it, of collective, of technology in person, because it's the continuous use of artifacts and cultural forms and the continuous creation of it, which is at stake here in the development of practice. And crucially, I think the idea is that agency through participation implies participating in the constitution of an activity, not just choosing it, not just mastering it, not just enjoying relatedness in it, but constituting it, framing it, we could say, with Erwin Goffman. So in creating the activity, the question of who is part of it, what is going on, how are we doing it, and what for? Those questions are at stake, and that is what determines or develops our motivation. So this is the theory, and you can see already that it's a special reading of it, a special reading of a special period in the development of what was called the German Scandinavian critical psychology of Ute Osterkamp, Frege Haug, Klaus Holzkamp, and others. Now here's an example of how this could play out today. Aesthetics. I take up aesthetics because of the aesthetic turn. This is my colleague, the philosopher Sverre Hafensø, who says art, aesthetics is everywhere. He says, the turn to aesthetic and aestheticization is a broad and sweeping, all-extensive and all-influencing contemporary shift, transversally affecting and decisively changing the game in and across a number of traditionally distinguished sectors or fields. So, but the question is, of course, is it everywhere like drops of oil in water? Or is it used as tools for other purposes? This leads to kind of the dilemma or the problem. What is going on with the aesthetic turn is that we are instrumentalizing art, and does that mean that we're reducing it, maybe even destroying it to kitsch? And I think many artists would say that, well, art has to be done for art's sake. L'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. And of course, there's the pragmatic pseudo-solution used by the WHO to measure whether art is healthy and so on. You can sort of count subjective measures and relate it to subjective measures of well-being, and you can prove that art is actually modestly conducive to health. But the basic question of what is art and what's it doing in other practices still needs to be addressed. This is where Rancière's theory of aesthetics might help us. So he, among many others, of course, but it's a recent sort of approach to aesthetics. He sort of retraces how aesthetics moves from the classical ethical regime, which we still know in the saying, the art of doing this or that, the art of medicine, for instance, the art of counselling, where it's just the proper way to do things. And then with the Renaissance, historically, art was increasingly also specialized in special institutions. So art for art's sake was sort of established. And the problem was then posed, well, how does that sort of relate to our lives? But his answer is then the aesthetic regime, which is actually art is about changing, transforming practices, activities, and what they mean to us. This he uses the term dissensus, which is the transformation of clashes between regimes of sense. Here's one formulation. What dissensus means is an organization of the sensible where there is neither a reality concealed behind appearances nor a single regime of presentation and interpretation of the given imposing its obviousness on all. It means that every situation can be cracked open from the inside, reconfigured in a different regime of perception and signification. And to reconfigure the landscape of what can be seen and what can be thought is to alter the field of the possible in the distribution of capacities and incapacities. And this also creates community, addresses the question of who do things together. As essential community is one which is characterized by recognizing the differences of sense, the clashes of regimes of sense. So it sort of is a way to establish, invite to a shared world, as Bourdieu talks about it in his relational aesthetics. Through art understood as dissensus, we can sort of break open regimes of sense and then invite other agents, participants within our aesthetic practices. So it's kind of mundane transformation that happens potentially sort of everywhere. It's not just the poetics of practice, it's not just the art of doing things right. It's the art of changing, the art of transforming, of creating new ways of doing things. So this has a long history, this approach to modern art. Even in psychology, here is Vygotsky already talking about art as the tool of society, the social technique of emotion, the organization of our future behavior. So Vygotsky's approach to how we create culture all the time is also expressed in his psychology of art already. And nowadays, Paul Stenner is saying something similar in his work on liminality and experience. I'll leave that to himself to explain, perhaps. But actually, this means that we can see aesthetic practices also as the sculpturing of the self, of the mediated, the self that we continuously together produce. And this might be an approach to meta-motives, because motif, what the art is about, it's actually about creating ways that we can deal with ourselves collectively and individually. Here's an example. In a place called U-Turn, which is a facility for young drug users in Copenhagen, they have developed something they call aesthetic documentation. They work with aesthetics in their work with young drug users. Now, in addiction, we have a motivation problem as a very big issue, because addiction itself could be said to be a caricature of the instrumental, pragmatic self. You just use a means to push your well-being in a certain direction, and then that's what breaks you down. And then you're addicted, and you find out that you ought to be motivated for changing your habits, and you ought to be more motivated for being motivated, and so on and so forth. So these are the problems that the young people who take drugs are dealing with. And what you see in the field is this pragmatic approach I mentioned. Motivational interviewing arose in this field, but also anti-pragmatic approaches, such as the 12 steps, which is basically the recognition that we cannot deal with ourselves in a pragmatic way, which is paradoxically often exactly approached very pragmatically by people in the 12 steps communities. That's a long story. I can't go into that right now. But anyway, so in U-Turn and around U-Turn in Copenhagen, they have this legacy of narrative practice, narrative therapy, where they have experimented with aesthetic elements for a long time. And the question, of course, here is that an instrumentalization of aesthetics in counseling, in psychotherapy, for instance, by the use of what they call poetic recapitulation, or poetic recap, or is it a transformation of it? I try to articulate the latter part, because that sort of addresses the notion of meta motivation, and in Rancière's theory of aesthetics, that's how it could be made sense of. And we have made a website portal that you can look at called Stuff if you're interested. But here's an example. They had this project with video films at what they call the evening group in U-Turn. They have these groups of young clients who meet up regularly and talk about their lives and so on. But in this specific project, they did something different. Those young clients, they recorded short videos of a couple of minutes, and then there was this film director from the film school, Camilla Arlien Søborg, who interpreted their videos, and then they discussed them on the basis of this. So here's an example. This is the Stuff website. But let's see. So here's one. Let's call him Alex, one of those young people, and he's interviewed about it. One of my colleagues, Mads Bank, interviewed him, and he was sort of playing the role of this hash head kind of guy, and he said, "Oh, the first video I recorded was like, shit, I forgot to make a video, and then I recorded while I was on my bike going there." "Okay," says Mads, "on your bike on the way over?" "Yeah, I completely forgot." And then that woman from the film school, she would read a lot of stuff into it. And here you see here's the film director. And she says, "Oh, I felt it was a little dangerous, and also I bike every day in Copenhagen, and you never stopped. But then you like kept turning, or the film keeps turning, so it runs really, really fast. So even if this like kind of oozes freedom, the speed is also something a little dangerous, but something to keep an eye on too. Like there's a focus that, like when you're biking, you wouldn't look down in the crossbars, but it's like an anchor in the middle of all this very like fast, confusing, really, it may seem the asphalt. So I think really this tells a story a lot about holding on to something while many things move all around you, and also that this freedom comes with something dangerous. So this is interesting because even though it seems quite accidental and Alex doesn't accept the film director's interpretation, really, at the end, it means a lot to him. So he says, I think at the end, if we were to describe our video, and in 3 words, I chose keep the grip, because you have to keep the grip on your bike. Everything moves so fast, and what if you topple over? It's high speed and things pass by on all sides around you. Then there's this one bicycle frame. This was just like a church nave hanging down. So a lot of deep layers. And if you have the narrative with the nave and the bike, everything flies past, well, then yes, except you haven't thought about all those layers in it. I think only that one layer, the one where you have a goal, and if you walk out and you're not a resolute kind of person, then it gets tough if you're thrown off your course. But if you have that narrative with many layers, and a lot has been analyzed, then there's a lot to fall back on if the first layer is knocked off course. So what's going on here, we could hypothesize at least, is that through this work with the video and the intervention of the film director, the complex open narrative has been scaffolded out of this seemingly arbitrary aesthetic production. It's been sort of recreated as a work of art through the interpretation and connected to deeper layers of a larger culture. For instance, the church nave suddenly comes in and becomes part of the story of anchoring here. So this was just a glimpse. This was just one. I have to conclude, I think now. A glimpse of how we can work with motives and meta-motives in aesthetic practices, aesthetics that transform the standards around addiction and counselling and treatment and so on. And doing it by addressing deeper layers to sort of help us confront crisis, but at the same time, not just blend into the given culture, but actually be inventive and creative. Our knowledge is kind of part of that as well. We produce what Rancière would call the poetics of knowledge. So let's return to Bruno Latour's hypothesis. The health crisis induces us to prepare for climate change. It's a dress rehearsal. So he's using these metaphors in order to make us understand the connection between this crisis and the deeper climate crisis. And this is a poetics of knowledge. It's a metaphor, but it's a way to construct a kind of knowledge as relevant to our situation now and to how we should deal with it. And we could also talk a bit with Stiegler, who does more than just address the world with his appeals, just like Morten Nissen does. He talks about social self-sculpturing as contributory research, where he says, if we view culture, arts, and knowledge as trans-individual processes through which groups sculpt themselves by sharing common practices. And in the end, the event of the Anthropocene demands a new ecology of educational subjectivity. And this is what we are contributing to with our human sciences. And so finally, you could say this a notion of passionate communities of care that are still situated in terms of what Stiegler was asking for, as I mentioned in the beginning. Here's Chantal Mouffe in today's newspaper Libération, saying that the left must be able to elicit common effects, and passions, to crystallize in the creation of a collective, a we, around democratic values. These effects do not work at the cost of reason. Spinoza said that ideas only have force when they meet passions. The construction of a common identity has both effective and discursive elements. This is the key challenge in the ideological struggle, says Chantal Mouffe. So if we sort of only think of the political struggle as our intervention into it as the intervention of reason, then it leads us astray. But the intervention with passion is not something that can only be taken up by the populists such as Modi and Trump, but something that we could also address. So the work on aesthetics in the deeper layers in an inventive and creative way is not only sort of the local work with drug users and so on and so forth, but also at the political level. I guess I had to end my talk right now, but I'm curious about what you think of it. Thanks for your attention.